United States Army Air Forces. Over Germany. June 1944. Late morning, deep inside enemy airspace. The B-17 wasn't where it was supposed to be. High above Germany, the bomber stream moved the way it always did, tight, orderly boxes, overlapping fields of fire, every aircraft locked into position for mutual protection. That formation wasn't just procedure, it was survival. Step out of it, even slightly, and you became exposed. And one bomber had stepped out. Not by much. Not recklessly. Just enough. It flew a little low and slightly off to the side, its spacing imperfect in a way experienced pilots would notice immediately. From a distance, it looked sloppy, vulnerable, like a machine struggling to keep up under pressure. To the Luftwaffe, it looked tempting. German interceptor pilots were trained to read bomber formations at a glance. They knew where defensive fire was thickest, where gun coverage overlapped, and where it thinned. A bomber drifting out of position didn't look like chance. It looked like opportunity. Radio chatter reflected that confidence. The lone wasn't discussed as a threat, but as a mistake. A straggler was easier to isolate, easier to overwhelm, easier to destroy without charging straight into the heart of the bomber box. They'd seen it countless times. Crews got exhausted, engines lost power, flak damaged control surfaces, formation discipline cracked, and one aircraft slipped just enough for fighters to pounce. That was how the air war usually went. But this B-17 wasn't slipping. Its crew knew exactly what they were doing. Inside the aircraft, nothing felt casual. The engines ran smooth. Airspeed was steady. The offset wasn't drift. It was deliberate, calculated down to seconds and degrees. Gunners weren't scanning blindly. They were watching specific approach lanes, waiting. The bomber was flying wrong on purpose. What the Luftwaffe read as weakness was positioning. By easing slightly out of formation, the B-17 created a funnel. Any interceptor going after it would come in from predictable angles that avoided the heaviest fire from the main formation, but still felt safe enough to commit to an attack. That predictability was the trap. The first German fighters turned toward the bomber with confidence. They expected a quick kill, or at worst, a damaged aircraft forced to fall away. They didn't anticipate anything beyond the usual scattered defensive fire. What they met instead was control. The bomber didn't jink or panic. It didn't rush back toward the formation. It held its line just long enough for the attackers to fully commit, closing the distance, narrowing their options, locking themselves into approach paths they couldn't break off from cleanly. Then the guns opened. Not all at once. Not wastefully. Each gun fired within its assigned arc. Bursts were short and deliberate, timed for convergence rather than volume. The goal wasn't to scare attackers away. It was to end them. From inside the Luftwaffe cockpits, something felt wrong almost immediately. There was no chaos, no panic. Fire came from angles that should have been thin. Attacks that should have passed through light resistance slammed into tight, lethal bursts instead. In seconds, the fight stopped looking like a hunt. It looked like an ambush. And by then, the interceptors were already too close to disengage cleanly. From a distance, the bombers flying had looked clumsy, even laughable. Up close, the reason became clear. And by the time that realization spread, turning away was no longer enough to save them. Luftwaffe pilots were not careless hunters. By 1944, they were experienced, analytical, and cautious with their lives. Intercepting a B-17 formation was never casual. It was geometry, timing, and risk management. Pilots chose attack paths that minimized exposure to overlapping gunfire and maximized time on target. That is exactly why the offset bomber drew them in. A bomber flying slightly out of position changes the math. It appears to weaken the formation's defensive lattice. The angles that would normally be swept by crossfire look thinner. The distance between supporting bombers appears wider than it really is. From a fighter cockpit, this looks like permission. Head-on attacks were still dangerous, but a lone or misaligned bomber suggested a narrower cone of return fire. Tail approaches promised longer firing windows. Slashing side passes seemed safer when overlap looked reduced. The B-17's position suggested all three. German pilots committed in confidence because the situation matched their training. Nothing about the bomber's behavior contradicted expectation. It did not maneuver erratically. It did not drop altitude suddenly. It did not sprint back into formation. It behaved like a tired aircraft trying to hold on. That illusion mattered. Once an interceptor commits to an attack run, options shrink rapidly. Speed, closure rate, and angle lock the pilot into a path. Breaking off early risks collision or exposure. Staying in invites fire, but doctrine assumed that fire would be scattered and panicked. It was. Inside the bomber, gunners tracked approach vectors, not individual aircraft. Each man knew which corridor was his responsibility. They did not swivel wildly. They waited until fighters crossed invisible thresholds, ranges where dispersion tightened and reaction time vanished. This is the part Luftwaffe pilots did not anticipate. They expected resistance. They did not expect choreography. The bomber's slight offset did not weaken coverage, it reshaped it. Instead of broad, diluted overlap, fire zones were stacked along predictable approach lanes. Fighters that committed found themselves entering layered arcs sequentially, not simultaneously. One gun would open, forcing a microcorrection. That correction fed the fighter into the next arc. Each defensive burst pushed attackers into tighter geometry rather than away from it. The illusion of safety collapsed mid-approach. By then, disengagement was costly. Pulling away exposed the aircraft's belly or tail. Continuing meant closing into converging fire. There was no clean exit, only worse options. Some pilots tried to press through. Others attempted abrupt breaks. Neither worked consistently. The bomber's discipline denied both escape and dominance. It did not chase kills. It did not spray ammunition. It waited, corrected, and fired where the fighter had to be, not where it was a second earlier. From the formation behind, this looked surreal. Fighters that should have made clean passes were falling away trailing smoke. Attacks arrived confidently and ended abruptly. The space around the offset bomber filled with short-lived motion and sudden absence. The Luftwaffe had taken the bait because it made sense. What they hadn't realized was that the bait was placed by people who understood their thinking just as well as they understood bomber defense. And once that understanding locked both sides into motion, the outcome stopped being negotiable. The interceptors were no longer choosing targets. They had become them. What decided the encounter was not surprise alone. It was restraint. B-17 gunners were trained to fire defensively, but many crews, especially under stress, fell into wasteful habits. Long bursts, early firing, tracers flung out in hope more than intent. That kind of fire could scare attackers away, but it rarely finished them. This crew did something different. They waited. Inside the bomber, every gun position had a purpose. Nose, top turret, ball, waist, tail each covered a specific slice of airspace. The gunners were not competing for targets. They were sequencing them. Fighters were allowed to enter zones before fire opened, compressing time and distance until evasive options disappeared. This required trust. Each gunner trusted the others to hold their fire until it was time. No one tried to be first. No one panicked when an interceptor grew larger in the sights. Fire began only when geometry favored certainty. When it did, it was devastating. Short bursts snapped out in precise intervals. Tracers walked into engine blocks and cockpits rather than filling the sky. Hits accumulated quickly because the fighter had no room left to maneuver. Speed, once an advantage, became inertia. Some interceptors disintegrated almost instantly. Others limped away trailing smoke, only to be finished by another gun position as they crossed into a different arc. The bomber did not chase kills. It let movement carry the fighters where the guns already were. This was the inversion the Luftwaffe had not anticipated. They expected bomber defense to be reactive, guns responding to threats. Instead, the defense was proactive, shaping the fight before the first shot was fired. The bomber's position had already decided where the fight would happen. From inside the fighter cockpits, the experience was unnerving. The usual cues were missing. There was no wild spray of fire to judge distance, no obvious panic to exploit, just sudden, accurate bursts arriving exactly where the pilot had committed to fly. Pilots who survived the first pass radioed warnings. Something was wrong with that bomber. But warnings came too late to help those already inbound. Attack waves had momentum. Fighters behind could not see what those ahead were experiencing until they vanished. One by one, interceptors stopped returning. From the bomber formation, crews began to notice the pattern. Fighters approached the offset B-17 aggressively and then did not reappear. The air around it cleared in a way that felt unnatural for deep penetration into Germany. The bomber was no longer exposed. It was radioactive. German pilots began to adjust tactics mid-fight, wider passes, earlier breaks, less commitment, but even caution worked against them. Half-committed attacks exposed aircraft longer without delivering fire, giving gunners more time to place shots. The trap did not require boldness to work. It punished it. By the time the Luftwaffe recognized that the bomber's mistake was deliberate, the damage was already done. 11 interceptors had entered the engagement. None would make it back. Not because they lacked skill, but because they had been invited into a fight whose outcome was already shaped by discipline, geometry, and the patience to wait until the moment when resistance stopped being an option. The most striking moment came after the last attack. Not during it. For several seconds, no fighters appeared. The airspace ahead was empty in a way it had not been since the formation crossed into enemy territory. Gunners stayed alert, fingers resting on triggers, eyes scanning corridors that had been busy moments earlier. Nothing came. Smoke drifted downward. Bits of debris glittered briefly in sunlight before vanishing below the cloud layer. The bomber held its offset position a little longer, just in case the absence was a trick. It was. German controllers had no more aircraft to commit in that sector. 11 fighters had failed to respond to recall. No distress calls followed them back. No silhouettes reappeared at altitude. The engagement had ended not with pursuit, but with void. Inside the B-17, there was no celebration. Crews did not cheer or shout. Training discouraged it. More importantly, no one was certain it was truly over. The bomber eased back toward proper alignment, rejoining the formation smoothly, as if nothing unusual had happened. From the outside, it now looked normal again. That normality was deceptive. What had occurred in that pocket of sky was not luck. It was not a fluke of gunnery. It was a demonstration of how air combat had changed by 1944. Individual bravery still mattered, but understanding the opponent's expectations mattered more. The Luftwaffe had expected a weak bomber. They had encountered a prepared one. This mattered beyond the loss count. German interceptor doctrine relied on overwhelming isolated aircraft quickly. When isolation became a deliberate posture rather than a failure, the doctrine lost its teeth. Word spread after the mission. Pilots spoke of a bomber that wanted to be attacked, one that did not flee or flinch, one that waited. The story carried an edge of disbelief. Fighters were not supposed to lose cleanly to a single bomber. But the math was unavoidable. 11 aircraft had committed. 11 had not returned. Not because the bomber was invincible, but because it had turned expectation into a weapon. It had flown wrong in exactly the way the Luftwaffe expected, and then punished them for believing it. In the air war over Germany, that lesson traveled fast. Some pilots adapted. Others never encountered another bomber like it. But on that day, high above enemy territory, mockery turned into silence. And a single rejoined the formation, mission intact, carrying with it proof that discipline could be deadlier than aggression. When the shooting stopped, the crew did not relax. That was the habit that kept them alive. Each gunner stayed on station, scanning the same corridors that had been busy minutes earlier. Ammunition was checked quickly and quietly. Jammed belts were cleared, barrels cooled. No one spoke about what had just happened, not because it wasn't remarkable, but because talking about it felt premature. Combat had taught them that silence could be deceptive. Inside the cockpit, the pilots held course without comment. Engines were steady, airspeed unchanged. The bomber did not surge forward or drift back. It simply continued on the line it had chosen, long enough to confirm the absence of movement. Only then did it slide back toward the formation. The transition was smooth, almost casual. From a distance, there was no sign that anything unusual had occurred. The bomber blended back into the geometry of the box as if it had never left it. That normality mattered. Drawing attention after a fight could invite a second one. The crew knew better than to signal success through behavior. They returned to the formation not as victors, but as participants again. Inside the aircraft, the mood was controlled. There was relief, yes, but no celebration. Each man understood how narrow the margins had been, a mistimed burst, a jam at the wrong second, a fighter choosing a slightly different approach angle. Any of those could have reversed the outcome. What they felt most strongly was confirmation. The plan had worked. Not because the enemy was careless, but because the enemy had behaved exactly as expected. That predictability, once understood, had been decisive. The bomber resumed its role as one aircraft among many. But the sky around it stayed empty longer than usual. Other crews noticed the absence before they understood the cause. Gunners scanned sectors that should have been busy and found nothing. Pilots exchanged brief glances, checking instruments for signs of an unseen threat. Radios carried short, cautious questions that went unanswered. Where had the fighters gone? From within the formation, the offset bomber's earlier position made the answer clearer. Crews had watched fighters peel off toward it, confident, aggressive, and then fail to reappear. No long chases, no extended dogfights, just commitment followed by absence. The realization spread quietly. That bomber had drawn the attack. And it had ended it. This altered behavior across the box. Gunners tightened discipline. Pilots held formation more carefully. No one wanted to imitate the maneuver without understanding it fully, but everyone recognized what had happened. The sky felt different. Not safe. Just altered. German intercepts usually came in waves. Even after losses, replacements appeared. That rhythm was missing now. The formation moved forward under a strange, temporary immunity, earned, not granted. Crews understood it would not last. But for this stretch of sky, the balance had tipped. The Luftwaffe had learned something painful, and learning takes time. Time the bomber formation now had. The offset aircraft remained unremarkable again. And that was its greatest protection. The success of the trap rested on one principle: expectation. Air combat doctrine trains pilots to recognize patterns quickly. Those patterns save lives until someone weaponizes them. The B-17 crew did exactly that. They did not invent a new tactic. They exploited a familiar one. Isolated bomber equals opportunity. By presenting a textbook weakness, the bomber removed uncertainty from the interceptors' decision-making. Fighters did not hesitate. They committed. And commitment is irreversible once geometry locks in. The crew understood that fear causes caution, but confidence causes closure. That is why the bomber did not exaggerate its deviation, Too far from formation would have raised suspicion. Too erratic would have suggested a trap. The offset was subtle, believable, and perfectly timed. The gunnery followed the same logic. Fire was withheld until escape was expensive. Bursts were short enough to deny feedback, accurate enough to deny correction. Every choice reduced the attacker's options rather than increasing pressure. This was not bravery. It was discipline. The Luftwaffe pilots were skilled. Many had survived dozens of engagements. What defeated them here was not inexperience, but predictability. Predictability the bomber crew had studied carefully. Once expectation was understood, outcome followed. The number did not become clear in the air. It emerged later, after landings and reports and cross-checks. Fighter units failed to account for aircraft that had launched. Controllers noted silence where call signs should have been. Reconnaissance did not find crash sites immediately. 11 interceptors. None returned. For the bomber crew, the figure arrived as information, not triumph. They had not counted victories in the sky. They had focused on survival. The idea that all attackers had been lost felt abstract, almost unreal. For the Luftwaffe, it was not. 11 missing aircraft from a single engagement stood out sharply in late-war Germany. Losses were expected, but this pattern was unsettling. There had been no running fight, no drawn-out pursuit. Just disappearance. Analysts searched for explanations, whether misidentification, coincidence, none satisfied. The geometry pointed to one conclusion: the bomber had controlled the engagement. That realization traveled quietly. Pilots adjusted behavior, some hesitated longer before committing, others widened attack angles. Caution crept back in. And caution, in a war of interception, costs opportunities. When the bomber landed, it looked ordinary. There were no dramatic holes torn through the fuselage, no emergency crews racing alongside, just another aircraft rolling to a stop, engines ticking down after hours in the air. On the ground, the crew spoke plainly. They described positions, timings, angles. They did not dramatize, they did not speculate. What mattered was accuracy. Others would read these reports and decide whether the tactic was repeatable. It was, but not casually. The maneuver required discipline, trust, and absolute fire control. Without those, isolation became vulnerability again. The difference was not the offset. It was the restraint. The crew understood that. They had not found a trick. They had demonstrated a principle. When the enemy believes they are choosing the fight, they are already late. The bomber was refueled, rearmed, scheduled again. War did not pause for stories. The Luftwaffe mocked the bomber's flying style because it fit a familiar story. A bomber out of position meant weakness. Weakness meant opportunity. Opportunity meant a quick kill. That logic had worked until it didn't. On that day over Germany, the logic was reversed. The bomber did not invite attack because it was vulnerable. It invited attack because it was prepared. 11 interceptors committed. None returned. Not because the bomber was lucky. Not because the pilots were reckless. But because expectation had been studied, shaped, and used. The aircraft flew wrong in exactly the way the enemy expected, and punished them for trusting that expectation. In the late air war, survival did not belong only to the fastest or the strongest. It belonged to those who understood how the other side thought. And high above Germany in 1944, a single proved that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the sky is the aircraft that looks like it shouldn't be there.